Yo, we are getting the Ralph Fiennes Odyssey movie before we're getting Grand Theft Auto 6, and I am not mad about it. I really hope some of my listeners get that joke. It's kind of a stock joke online. If you go in like the comments on a YouTube video or Instagram or something, when something really weird happens, like when Biden dropped out, some people on Twitter were like, we're getting Biden dropping out of the race before we're getting Grand Theft Auto 6. And it's just this ongoing running gag that Grand Theft Auto, the video game series, has only released 5 installments. Everybody's waiting for the 6th one, and we're bated breath. We're all on tenterhooks, but we're getting all these other things before that. And I, sad to say, come at me if you're a big Grand Theft Auto fan, I was never one of the Grand Theft Auto bros. I do not see the appeal, I have to admit. This maybe makes me a squish, but driving around, hijacking cars, like abusing people, violating various laws and norms, it's not enough to me. I get the bad boy story, and it's okay if you've got a morally complicated figure, but I don't get why you would want to play a game where the point is basically just to savage stuff. I could be wrong, but anyway, that means I'm not that interested in getting Grand Theft Auto 6. I am extremely interested in this movie, The Return, that is coming out with Ralph Fiennes, that seems to be about Odysseus coming home at the end of his journeys. We don't know a ton about this movie yet. They haven't released a bunch of PR material, but I get the impression that this movie is going to start right around book 13, where Odysseus finally makes it back home. And this is one of these features of the Odyssey that if you haven't read the Homeric poems that we're talking about here, you might be surprised, because if you think of the Odyssey, you probably think of Scylla and Charybdis and Circe and witches and the Cyclops and all these monsters and myths and legends and stories at sea. But the funny thing about it is when you actually read the poem, that it's surprisingly little of the poem that is actually about those voyages. A lot of it is told in flashback. Obviously, it's kind of the centerpiece. A lot of the set pieces of the poem come during that time. But the story itself is actually a much more human story, and in some ways more intimate story about a man's relationship to his homeland after the war. It's about journeying on your way back from Odysseus coming back from the Trojan War, and how to make your way, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, make your way back home. I think this is one of the ways that the poem just resonates forever, so deeply in every generation, because I think we all know, and I think maybe men especially have this tension in their lives between going out into the world, striving, seeking adventure, and wanting to build that safe home base and to support and love and nurture a family, which is kind of why you do all the adventuring in the first place. It's the point of the thing, but it's also really exciting to go out and adventure and to fight wars and battles. And one of my favorite poems, Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson, is about this tension. It's about after Odysseus gets home. Does he really want to be home, or does he want to strike out again as he gets older? Does he feel comfortable settling down, or does he think, I'm feeling stir crazy and I gotta go? So that's not part of the original Homeric poem, but that idea is kind of the whole poem. The theme of the whole thing is nostos, coming home. It's where we get our word nostalgia. And so I think it's really interesting that they've got this movie coming out that seems to be about that moment, which is a lot of the poem is after Odysseus makes his way home. How does he fight his way back into the hearth? Famously, there are all of these suitors that are trying to win his wife over, and he's got to clear them out, but he's also got to reintroduce himself to his son. He's got to reacquaint himself with domestic life. It's a whole psychological narrative as well as an adventure story, and this is part of what makes the whole thing so great. So every now and then in this life, when there's a particular tweet or maybe news story or announcement that just really seems to press all my buttons, I feel like somewhere out there in the universe, there's like a Spencer Klavan bat signal that goes out. And all of my lovely buddies online and listeners to this podcast and all of you out there, you've just taken upon yourselves as one, as a unit, as if the memo has gone out, that you're going to text me this tweet, you're going to DM me this thing, and everybody from all corners, I suddenly get inundated with this, like, have you seen this lately? What do you think? Which I just love, because I guess it means I have a very distinctive brand, and there's a specific kind of thing that I like to talk about. Like when the the Roman Empire meme was going around, when everybody was chattering about why do men think about the Roman Empire so much. It was like we were 3 weeks into that trend, and I was still getting voice memos being like, have you talked about this yet? What do you think? Like, do you think about the Roman Empire? And I was like, yes, in fact, I have heard of this. 1 or 2 people may have mentioned it to me. And so this was one of those moments where there was a tweet about how they're putting out a movie with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche, a great, great actress. And she's playing Penelope, I guess, and Ralph Fiennes is playing Odysseus. And it's coming out I guess it's hitting the film festivals on September 27th. It'll be at the Toronto Film Festival, and then December 6th, the rest of us will be able to get our mitts on it, get our butts in seats. I am really stoked. I'm cautious, nervous, don't know. Always when they take up some great classic work that I really love, I'm anxious to see how they do it. I was anxious when they took up Three Body Problem, which is a modern novel series that I really love. And there's always the possibility they're going to ruin stuff. Definitely things are going to get changed in adaptation. That's normal and fine. But I'm not as shell-shocked and traumatized and terrified as I would have been had they made this announcement in like 2020 or so. Because there was a time when everything that got adapted was getting funneled into this weird, silly political set of obsessions that we call woke or identity politics or whatever. And then you just knew if they picked something up, it was going to be like, Odysseus was actually disabled. Like, did you know he was in a wheelchair? Or something crazy like that. I'm not as worried that this is going to be a quote-unquote take, and so I'm cautiously optimistic. These 2 actors, Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche, haven't been together in a movie since The English Patient, which was 1996, but they're 2 great actors, and everybody's been texting me about this thing. It's one of those Spencer Clavin bat signal moments, and I thought this is really awesome because it's far enough out. We have almost half a year before this thing is in wide release, and it's far enough out that we can kind of talk about Homer and the Odyssey a little bit on the show, and I have been just waiting for the right moment to revisit Homer and go back to our earliest roots here on Young Heretics. If you have been with the show since the Iliad episode, that means you are one of the OGs, because this was our very first episode, and I've always wanted to redo it or come back to the subject again and figure out a right way to approach it, because inevitably, when you start any endeavor, when you look back on your first efforts, you have a lot of affection. I've got a lot of happy feeling about that time. And I know a lot of you guys liked that episode. But of course, you're always going to look back and think, man, I would do this differently if I started it now. And often when people ask me, like, have you covered this or have you covered that, I'm really glad that I have this bank of episodes that I can send to people, be like, yeah, if you want to know my take on Crime and Punishment, here's the episode I did on that or whatever. But when people ask me, have you done one on Homer? I'm like, yeah, but it's not really like a full-fledged Young Heretics take on Homer, because I was still getting my sea legs, still feeling out what it was like to do a podcast at all. And it was only 30 minutes long. If you remember, it was the Iliad in 30 minutes, which I would never undertake to do. God, give me the confidence of my first time podcasting self, thinking I could just cover the Iliad in 30 minutes. And it was one of the most fascinating things, actually, about starting the podcast, was that the very first note I got from you guys was say more, ramble more, go on more tangents, talk about more stuff. I am a writer at heart, and as a writer, you learn that your runway is really short. People's attention span is tiny. They're going to afford you maybe 5 minutes to decide whether they're interested in what you're saying, and by 30 minutes, they're bound to be bored or moving on to the next thing. And so you always, as a writer, you're always paring down to just the core of what you have to say. And I kind of approached podcasting at first that way. And then I learned this wonderful thing that is a combination both of my wonderful listeners, you guys, and the nature of podcasting itself, which is unlike a lot of other digital media and unlike a lot of other forums that we use now in 2024, podcasting actually doesn't shrink your attention span. Podcasting is a place where you actually want to hang out together for longer and longer. And I've learned that, and I've started to feel that way. Like, this is a fun hangout session that we have together every week or twice a week. And so you do get to explore more stuff and go down more rabbit warrens. And I thought, okay, we've got this movie coming out that actually takes place at the very, very end of what you could think of as the Homer story. If you conceive of the Iliad and the Odyssey, these two great Greek poems, these foundational Greek poems, foundational not just to Greek civilization, but to Western civilization more generally. They're our earliest poems in this Athens side of the Western tradition. And this is the very end of the story they tell, because the earliest chronology begins with the Trojan War in the story that Homer is telling with the Iliad. And it goes through the war, obviously, and ends with the death of Hector in the Iliad, and then picks up quite a bit later after Troy has already fallen. Homer never wrote a poem about the actual fall of Troy. He just fast forwarded to the aftermath and gave us Odysseus' journey home. And so this movie that comes out is going to be the very end of a long, long story. And as listeners of Young Heretics, I want you guys to have the whole backstory. So I thought this was a great opportunity to return to our roots. We've been doing some politics lately, been following the news, but I always want this to be a refuge from the news as well as a resource for thinking about what's going on in current events. So whenever we want to, we can say what we said at the very beginning of this episode, or this show, right back in that first episode, which is, we're reading Homer and screw you. Screw all the other stuff, screw all the politics and whatever nonsense they come at you with about it's racist to like dead white men or something. Just tune all of that out and let's just talk about Homer. And so we've got some time now to do that. I want to reintroduce Homer to you. If you're new to the show, this will be our first time talking about it. If you've been with us for a while, it's been a long time and there's always more to say about Homer. And then what I thought I would do, this episode I'm just going to introduce the whole Homeric epics and read to you a little bit from the beginning of each of the two poems. But then what I thought I would do is I would give you a chronological order take on the Homeric poems. That is, I would start with the earliest plot point that I can find in the poems, and then walk you through it in that order. So not necessarily in the order that stuff appears in the poems, but just tell you the story using excerpts from the poems so that you can get a handle on this whole. I always think of it as a cinematic universe. I know that's kind of a played out metaphor, but I can't think of it any other way, because the Greek myths in antiquity really were kind of like the superhero myths that we have as Americans. There are some differences, but a major feature here is that you've got this giant stock, this kind of warehouse of stories that everybody kind of knows, that are mostly defined by the characters in them and the exciting, extravagant, over-the-top, larger-than-life human figures and divine figures or superhuman figures. And people like Odysseus and Telemachus, and then gods like Athena and Hephaestus and so on, are kind of like superheroes like Superman and the Green Lantern, and people in their orbit like Lois Lane, and all these kind of like pantheon of figures that then get worked and reworked back into all these different stories. But you also have kind of marquee versions, canon versions, if you like. And the Homeric poems are similar in that they are these big, almost official versions of a huge sea of storytelling that weaves, all these stories weave into one another. There are different versions, there's fan fiction, there's alternate timelines, and you can go swim in this thing forever. And I think it would be really cool if we could all go to this movie, Young Heretics crew assemble and go to this movie with an understanding where it fits in that larger tradition of telling and retelling these stories. So by the time we get done, I was hoping we could get all the way up to the return of Odysseus at the end of this long timeline. And then we can go to the movie and I'll do a review and we'll figure out what we think of the whole thing. So, sound good? Cool. Okay, well, it's my show, so that's what we're doing. Let's remind ourselves now just what we're talking about. That's what I wanted to do today, is just set the scene again, take us back to the Homeric world, and ask, first of all, when we say Homer, who the heck are we talking about? And that question, posed in that very scholarly way, is what's known as the Homeric question. who was Homer? When did he live? Did he really write these poems? Did he really write or did he sing? How did these things make their way to us? All of these questions have been basically around for as long as we have been able to read about them. Back to antiquity, they were asking these questions. There was not a clear written record or a clear authoritative source that could tell, even say, Herodotus or Plutarch, where these poems originally came from. There were generally accepted views in antiquity and things that people thought more or less than others, and now, too, there are generally accepted things, but then there's a huge debate that's been raging and raging all over when did these things really take their full form? How do they take their full form? What are we looking at when we crack open an English edition of the Iliad or the Odyssey? Let's start with the basics, things that we can kind of agree on. These are two giant poems. They're called epic poems, which is a word we get from the word epos in Greek, and that means like a kind of story or something you tell. These are poems which originally we think would have been accompanied by some simple form of stringed music, stringed instrument music, and they probably would have been sung or chanted along the contours of the Greek pitch accent line. So Greek is a tonal language, not quite in the same way that, say, Chinese is a tonal language, but in the sense that there are ups and downs that you're supposed to make as you speak Greek. There are accents that tell you to move up in pitch, accents that tell you to stay down in pitch, and accents that tell you to go on a little roller coaster ride up and down. And we have texts that sort of explain this to us. So already I'm in slightly controversial territory, but my opinion is that whatever we're looking at when we look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, we know that they would have originally been sung and or chanted in group settings. And they probably would have started out in local settings. In fact, there was an opinion or a story told in antiquity that Homer himself was an individual man that composed these poems, but that he had disciples or even perhaps descendants, the Homeridae, and they, it was thought, lived and taught in Chios, which is an island to the west of Asia Minor, just off the western coast of Asia Minor, that is Turkey, where there were a lot of Ionian Greek settlements. So that's sort of the locale, and it seems pretty reliable that there would have been this tradition of, or even maybe guild, you might say, of singers, people passing things down. And after that, you get into already really, really choppy waters, because there are some people at one extreme, like the late, great Martin West, whom I've actually mentioned before on the podcast, an Oxford scholar, who did argue that even if Homer was originally working in an oral context, would have spoken and recited these poems, West argued that he would have had somebody write them down or would himself have written them down. Now that, I would say, is probably a minority view at this point. But on the other extreme, you've got people like Gregory Nagy, who is, it's the name spelled Nagy, who's really into the orality of the poems, that is, their nature as live action performances. And which of these things you think is true is going to determine what you think about how these poems were composed, whether they were kind of stitched together on the fly. Maybe Homer himself never existed as like the one guy who set them all down, and maybe he just came up with a bunch of different stories. There was somebody that kind of had a bunch of different tales and legends that he would tell at dinner parties or drinking parties and what have you, and then they gradually over time got kind of composed into this order, as if you had started with the stories of Superman and Spider-Man and all the different comic books, and then you had the Marvel Studios that kind of put them all together into this one big timeline. So that's one approach to it would be the sort of orality approach, where it starts out with a bunch of different stuff. And this would be associated with the idea of analysis. So Homeric scholars in general are divided into the analysts and the Unitarians, and they do what it sounds like. The analysts like to chunk up the poem, divide it up into these little smaller sections and say, this was originally there, but this wasn't, and this got repeated, so it must have been added in later, or whatever. And then the Unitarians, and I'm more of a Unitarian, although not exclusively a Unitarian, the Unitarians say, no, these poems have a completeness of composition, and you don't have to go all the way in Martin West's direction and say that they were actually written down in their original form. But you do, I think, as a Unitarian, you have to think there was a Homer. Generally, people sort of place him around the 8th century BC. And he did compose this altogether. And my reasons for thinking so have mostly to do with my reading of the poem as a whole. I think even the repetitions, which probably did come about as you were reciting these poems, getting to know them, delivering them to an audience, even the repetitions have a purpose. And so maybe these things did take shape in live performance, but they were clearly put together by one mind. And even some of the most strict analysts will end up sort of suggesting, well, maybe there was an editor later on that kind of gathered everything together. I think you're looking at an artist here with a style, with a distinctive voice. He changes from the Iliad to the Odyssey into a slightly more burlesque tone, but it's no greater a change than if you look at Shakespeare writing different plays. Homer was capable of multiple different styles, but I think there is clearly an Homeric style and Homeric approach. But this gets ugly, man. These fights, I mean, talk about the narcissism of small differences. If you've spent any time in academia, you know that the way these fights tend to go is you start out with somebody saying, I think that this shift in the way that vowels show up in this section of the poem might suggest something that happened historically as the poem developed over time. And then you end up with people literally just like throwing dry erasers at each other across the room. They get so intense because reputations are bound up in it and egos and all of that. If you really want a classic of this genre of people squabbling over Homeric minutiae, and it's a delight, let me tell you. From the spectator, from the cheap seats, you can get your popcorn like that Michael Jackson meme and just watch. Look up Martin West's response to Gregory Nage in the Bryn Mawr Classical Review. This is BMCR is a mainstay, a favorite. If you study ancient Greek or Latin texts, you probably read BMCR a lot because it's easily accessible. I think it's free. Basically, the whole archives are free. And so you can always find somebody writing about the latest scholarly work in classics. But there was a long, long spat between the Nage camp, who were more in the orality side, and the West camp, who was kind of a holdout for the extreme of the literary side of understanding Homer and these poems. And I will link to it in the description. It's just too good. West has this long and withering response to some of Nage's criticisms. It includes the line, his blood will surely run cold when he realizes what he has done. So if you're not in academia, this will be a real eye-opener for you about how academia works. If you are in academia, you'll recognize it instantly, but it's also just a blast. Anyway, these are the questions that we tend to raise about Homer. And they were raised in antiquity, but we do know that eventually, by the 5th century BC at least, these poems were poems. In other words, there were written copies of them. People could refer to authoritative versions of them. Probably they were still very heavily oral. That is, even though there were these written copies, you weren't expected only to use the written copies to engage with them. You were expected to memorize long sections, learn them, study them in school. This is the culture that is behind all that stuff we've talked about in Plato, where Plato is citing different Homeric passages and criticizing people's readiness, gullibility, readiness to take on what Homer says as gospel. It's because he's living in a culture where people are just steeped in this stuff. And even though there's no Bible of Greek religion, Homer becomes something like scripture. He becomes the headcanon version for all sorts of people of these stories that belong to the cultural patrimony of Greece more generally. And that's really important because of what Greece was. When I say Greece, we always think, oh yeah, that country on the map that sort of got those borders round about that peninsula, whatever, in the Aegean. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about ancient Greece. We're really talking about a collection of city-states and these different groups with different ethnic backgrounds, sometimes some of them, that had been thrown together by the threat of Persian invasion. Of course, they shared a language, so the Greek language was a major cultural signifier for all Greek-speaking peoples. But there was also this major historical shock to the system where Athens and Sparta had to band together and be allies against Persia. And so you have this time, very brief, but a real time of Greek cultural formation and Greek identity. And therefore, you had to find things that the Greeks shared, because they didn't share a whole lot. They had different origin stories, different histories, different ways of governing themselves. But the Homeric poems were one thing that they could kind of all agree on, and they became what you would now describe as a pan-Hellenic cultural marker. That is, pan-Hellenic meaning for all Greece. And it therefore became especially important for different city-states to have ownership over the Homeric poems. And arguably the city-state that did this best was Athens. And that's part of how Athens became the cultural hegemon of this collection of city-states. It was because they had the best scholars. They had, or they could claim at least, to have the richest intellectual tradition and heritage. And a part of this, at least in the memory after this time, the cultural memory after this time, remembered Homeric poems being a major part of Athenian cultural dominance. There's a famous passage from Cicero in De Oratore, which is in English just the orator or orator, where he talks about the Pisistratid kings. And we've mentioned these guys before on the podcast, but before Athens became solidly a democracy, before the Persian invasion, you have Pisistratus and his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, who briefly reinstate tyranny, briefly take over autocratic rule, and part of their attempt to shore up power, as much as many different despots have done, it was to kind of lay claim to cultural authority with Homer. Remember when we talked about Napoleon wanting to cozy up to Goethe and wanting to portray himself as kind of the master of all European culture? Well, Pisistratus seems maybe, or the Pisistratids seem to have done something similar. Cicero writes, whose learning is reported to have been greater in this period, or whose eloquence to have received more ornament from literature than that of Pisistratus, who is said to have been the first that arranged the books of Homer as we now have them, when they were previously confused. So this would be a point in your favor if you were suggesting that Homer wasn't always Homer, that the Iliad was kind of stitched together. Is this report we have, and there's another one that I'll read to you in just a second, that there were kind of a confusion of different books of Homer that got placed in order by Pisistratus himself. This would have been in the 6th century BC, so a couple hundred years after the guy that I think was Homer was composing. There certainly was some confusion, some disarray, some alternate variants that must have gradually gotten put together, stitched into this one giant work, or rather two giant works in this kind of one sequence of mythological events. And this is also true, Plutarch says, of Sparta, that much as Athens had it's called the Pisistratid recension, much as Athens had its kind of assembly of Homer and its consolidation of cultural and political power, so too under Lycurgus, who is this founding figure of Sparta, semi-mythical it seems, but nevertheless very important for Spartan self-understanding. Plutarch tells us that when Lycurgus was a young man, he went traveling in order to escape a kind of political controversy over whether he desired absolute power or not. And Lycurgus sailed from Crete to Asia with the intention of comparing with the Cretan civilization, which was simple and severe, that of the Ionians, which was extravagant and luxurious. So remember, the Ionian Greeks are the ones mostly to the east. They have this artsy-fartsy culture. That's where the Homeridae are going to be remembered as being. Just as a physician compares with healthy bodies those which are unsound and sickly, he could study the difference in their modes and forms of government. And one of the things that he did in this process, he made his first acquaintance with the poems of Homer, which were preserved among the posterity of Creophilus. And when he saw that the political and disciplinary lessons contained in them were worthy of no less serious attention than the incentives to pleasure and license which they supplied, he eagerly copied and compiled them in order to take them home with them. So this would be like the Lycurgan recension. And you note, actually, the very specific purpose to which Homer is already in Plutarch's imagination being put, which is moral instruction. And, of course, it's for his failures in moral instruction that Plato is going to fault Homer. But here we have this idea that actually putting Homer together is going to be good for us because it will reveal the whole range of human emotion, discipline, ideas that we can kind of learn from and take good examples from and eschew the bad examples. So, at least by the 5th century BC, whatever you think about how these poems initially came into being, we do have basically the set of stories that is taking on this particular form of the Iliad and the Odyssey, these two epics. And those epics are distinguished already from the cinematic universe in the background. So whether you think that it was Marvel Studios coming along and pulling out this material that hadn't previously been organized, or whether you think it was kind of the OG Homer getting riffed on and fanficked by a bunch of other singers, at this stage, by the high classical period that we really know a lot about because we have a lot of texts about it, we're dealing with a headcanon that is the Homeric canon, and then a bunch of other myths, some of which were ascribed to Homer. So sometimes you'll hear about the Homeric cycle, or just the epic cycle, and poems like the Cypria and the Margarites, and all these sort of little surrounding orbital satellites that kind of cluster around Homer. And people are very interested, especially later on in the Hellenistic era, which comes after the classic era. People seem to be very interested in assembling the one timeline. If you watch the Loki series on Disney Plus, I think it is, there's the sacred timeline, which is kind of the canon of what events really do happen. People get very interested in the mythic cycle or the epic cycle, but there's also a really strong view among a number of people that Homer is Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey are distinct and unique, and all this other stuff is kind of like barnacles around the side. So I'm going to read now to you from Herodotus, another Greek author who writes about the Persian Wars, tells the story of the Persian Wars, and on the way tells a million other great yarns. We've met him a bunch of times on this podcast, so I'm not going to dwell with him too much, just to say that Herodotus does something really interesting, which is he reviews, in the process of reviewing various historical accounts, he reviews various different versions of the Homer myths. And he gives one that Homer rejects. He says, it seems to me that Homer had also heard of this alternate version of the story, but since it was not as appropriate for epic composition as the other one which he adopted, he rejected it. But he did reveal that he nevertheless knew this version. So Herodotus goes on to cite a bunch of different passages from Homer. And he says, these verses make it clear that the Cypria cannot be a poem by Homer, but must have been composed by someone else, as does also a particular passage of the Cypria in which Paris and Helen arrive at Troy on the 3rd day of their voyage from Sparta, having sailed under fair breezes on a calm sea, while in the Iliad, Homer says that he was driven off course with her. So you see already how minutely people in the ancient world were analyzing the poems, figuring out their authorship, which ones were real and which ones weren't. And so the idea that the Iliad and the Odyssey are special comes down to us from antiquity. That is not one of the things that we've had to parse and sort of puzzle out in the modern world. I'm reading, by the way, from the landmark Herodotus, which these editions are so good. It's like eating cake. It's just all these different notes on the side and on the bottom, and these wonderful interpretative essays. And this is Robert Strassler's edition. He's the editor of the Herodotus, but the Thucydides is great. The Xenophon is great. They're really wonderful editions. And Herodotus gives us the picture that we need, I think, of these poems in order to understand what we're handling with when we read English versions. Because, of course, by the time you get to a translation, you're hundreds of years and long, long hours of effort away from the original. And in this case, the original is a little bit shrouded in darkness, although I think there are some things we can know with more certainty than others. I'm fairly persuaded, as I've said before, of the idea that there was a Homer. I think he probably didn't write, but that then as his poems took shape under his performance, they were refined over time, but not totally rewritten or rearranged significantly over time by these various different regimes, by the people that had an interest in doing so, and that by the 6th century BC, and certainly by the 5th century BC, we've got the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as distinct from a bunch of other fan fiction and cinematic universe stuff. So that gives us what we need to embark upon telling this story. And it is truly one of the greatest sets of stories ever told. I've sort of alluded to this already. The first one, the Iliad, tells the story of the sack of Troy, although it actually specifically drills down into one really quite small episode, which is the wrath of Achilles and his refusal to fight for the Greeks because his war prize, Briseis, has been stolen from him after Agamemnon's war prize, Chryseis, has been taken back to her father, Chryses. But that story kind of unfolds, and part of the way these poems work is by pinning down and drilling into one particular set of stories or one small narrative. They can spiral out by association into a bunch of other connected myths. And so through the Iliad, through the lens of the Iliad, we get a whole sense of this world and of the sailing of the Greeks from Troy and so on and so forth. And then from there, we move on to the Odyssey, where we have famously the stories of Odysseus' many wanderings. So what I wanted to do now, just to give you a flavor for these poems, and like I say, I'm going to then move on next week to start talking about the story itself and the poems and telling the story in chronological order. But I wanted to read to you the first 5 lines of each poem, because I think they show really nicely how, on the one hand, we are dealing with a very distinctive artist with a particular style, but on the other hand, he's doing 2 very different things in these 2 poems. So I'll start with the Iliad, and I've said this a bunch of times before on the podcast, but if you need a reminder, we're looking here at Greek poetry in dactylic hexameter, which sounds like this. Da 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 da. It's groupings of syllables that either go long, short, short, or long, long. And it's very, very difficult to capture this lilt that it has in English, because we don't really have quite any meters that really do this. Our iambic pentameter is the meter we use for epic poetry, but it's not anywhere near as versatile and flexible as this dactylic hexameter, which has 6 feet, 6 metrical units in it, and can swap different feet out. You have the dactyls, the long, short, short, and the spondees, long, long, that make each line sound a little bit different. So I'm going to present to you with my own translations in a second and say how I think this works, but I want you to hear the music of it again so that you can feel the way that this would have been delivered. The kind of, I always call it hoofbeats and heartbeats of the Homeric poetry. So here we go. Iliad, first 5 lines. Men aedethea peleajo Achilleos, ulaminen he muriachaios alge etheke, pollas diphthemus psychas aidi proiapsen, heroon autus de heloria teuche cunessen, oio noisite passe, dios de telea tobule. Alrighty, now let me read you my translation, and this is what I've done with the verse, and I'll defend some of my choices here in a second, but just to show it to you, and then I'll do the same thing with the Iliad, or the Odyssey rather. Here's my translation of the Iliad, Book 1, line 1. Rage, goddess, sing me the fury of Peleus' son, Achilles, death-dealing, laying uncountable wounds on the Greeks, hurling so many strong warriors' souls down to Hades, heroes turned into carrion feasts for the dogs and the flocks of birds. Zeus had his plan carried out to the full. All right, put a pin in that. Remember that, bookmark that, and now let's hear some of the Odyssey. This is the same section, just the first 5 lines of the first book of the Odyssey. Andramoi ennepemusa pollutropon hos malapolla plangthe epe troies hieron ptoliethron epersen pollund anthropon iden astea kai noon egno pollad hogen ponto pathen algea hon katathumon arnumenos hein te psukein kai noston hetairon. Okay. Here's my translation, and again, I'm going to defend some of my choices here in a bit. Tell me, Muse, about a man of many ways and wanderings after he sacked the citadel of Troy, the many towns he saw, and how he came to know the minds of all the many men that lived there, how his heart was wounded many a time at sea, straining to gain his life back and bring his comrades home. Okay, so I hope that one thing you'll have noticed in the difference between those two translations I did of the Iliad and the Odyssey is that even though there's a similar rhythm or the same rhythmic structure in both poems, there's a very, very different feeling and syntax going on. And it's much easier to spot this and to accomplish it in Greek because in ancient Greek you can freely rearrange the words in a sentence. Not totally at random. You can't just put any word anywhere, but you don't have to put them in the traditional sentence order that we need in English in order to make sense. If the dog bit the man, that's different than the man bit the dog, so you have to put it in one or the other order depending on what you want to communicate. Not so in Greek. And so you get more freedom, more liberty, and there is a lot more wandering in the Odyssey. It's almost a lilting sort of bard yarn that's going on here. It's like this hobbit tale kind of story. Andra moi enne pemusa, Muse, tell me about a man. Each poem begins, the first word is famously the subject of the poem. Menis in the Iliad is rage, the rage of Achilles. Aner, or Andra in the accusative, is the man, the character of the man Odysseus and how he wended his way back home. And we get, right off the bat, this big enjambment, which is when you end a line without finishing the thought, and then you carry the thought over onto the next line. Hos malapolla planthe, right? He did many wanderings, or he accomplished many wanderings, which you do not get in the Odyssey so much, although you do get the thought carried over to the next line. Mein aedethea peleia jo Achilleos is a complete thought. The rage, sing the rage goddess of Peleus' son Achilles. And then we have an extra added idea to spur us on into the next verse. Ulamene, the murderous or the destructive rage. But in the Odyssey, you can't even finish the first line without adding in what happens in the second line. Malapolla doesn't tell you anything until you get onto this enjambed planthe. So right off the bat, we might know or see that we're going to be wandering in this sort of sinuous way. We have some words and concepts that get shared and repeated, which is part of how I think we know we're dealing with an intentional artist here. A major word that comes up in both cases is algea, which means wounds or sorrows or pains. And there's a fascinating contrast that the poet builds between the algea that the rage of Achilles puts upon the Achaeans. The Achaeans suffer all these pains, which are physical blows, physical pains, and they end up getting killed and torn apart and eaten, their carcasses eaten by the dogs. But then we get the same idea, the algea, in line 4 of the Odyssey, and it's specified that they are algea katathumon, that is wounds of the heart. And so the poet has very, very consciously, and I think obviously consciously, drawn our attention to this change in mood. Maybe we already know the Iliad, and we know the story of the rage and the violence and the war, and this kind of drumbeat that we get of the rhythm in that, versus now this wandering sort of tale that a bard will now spin of a man, and the wounds at heart. We've changed our color, changed our tone, but stayed in the same cinematic universe, the same cognitive world, the same poetic world. And it's really kind of amazing and sophisticated if you think about it, to find this poem already barreling out of the gate at this early date in Greek poetry with so much nuance and artistry going on. There's other stuff too that you can kind of note. For example, by the time we get to line 4 of the Iliad, we have this line about making the heroes' corpses feasts for the dogs and birds. So I'll read to you. My translation was, hurling so many strong warriors' souls down to Hades, heroes turned into carrion feasts for the dogs and the flocks of birds. And what's really cool here about, in Greek, the teuche, which I've tried to recreate with the hurling, is that we're not totally sure whether it's Achilles who hurled the warriors' sons down to Hades or the rage of Achilles, the Menis that we had at the beginning. And it's almost like Achilles and his rage have been fused into one cosmic force that are an instrument of Zeus's plan, which we're just about to get famously at the end of the 5th line. Zeus's plan is being fulfilled, but it's like Achilles in the person of his rage, or the rage that overflows out of Achilles and sends these heroes' souls down. It's not clear which of those is the subject of Telche. And that's, I think, on purpose. That's an ambiguity that creates meaning in the poem. A sort of similar thing in the opening of the Odyssey, this line 5, Ar numenos hein te psychein kai noston hitairon, the most important line. And it's really amazing, again, to think about this, and it's impossible for you to imagine this wasn't one guy with a big vision for this whole sequence, because the same 5 lines, that set of 5 lines, do sort of the same thing. They introduce the subject at the very beginning, the manus and the aner, and then by the 5th line, you've got a major theme. In the Iliad, it's fate, it's the boule, the plan of Zeus, and the ambiguities of that. In the Odyssey, it's nostos, that homecoming, and that line, Ar numenos hein te psychein kai noston hitairon. He was straining to win back his soul and the homecoming of his companions. And so he's got this twofold mission, which in itself is sort of full of nuances and ambiguities, because the psyche in Greek, that's your soul, it's your life, it's your way of being. He's trying to get back to himself in some way, and indeed self is another legitimate translation of psyche. So he's trying to work his way back to the person he was, the place he lived, the man he was before he left and suffered at war, but he's also trying to get his comrades back home. And so there's enormous pathos just in these 5 lines, and there's also enormous craftsmanship and artistry. And I think this is just true throughout these poems. Is what makes them so endlessly rewarding to read. It's what makes me think there definitely was a Homer, one guy. I think he sang, but Wes thinks he wrote or had them written down, whatever. This is one artistic vision of the world. And that was what the ancients thought about. That's what Aristotle thought. In Poetics, Aristotle's book of literary criticism, chapter 8 of the Poetics, he says something really wonderful about the unity of these poems, which is that the Odyssey and likewise the Iliad center around an action that in our sense of the word is one. That is, they have this unitary action, this one idea behind them that then spirals around in these concentric circles out into all these other themes and ideas, but always anchored in this one thing, because that's the story that we're telling. When you put these things into English, it's always kind of a bittersweet experience, because they lose a lot, but they also gain a lot in terms of their vividness and their clarity. The meter thing is particularly hard. We've had a bunch of different approaches throughout the years to how to render Homeric meter. One famous example is Alexander Pope does rhyming couplets, so that's iambic pentameter, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, but every 2 lines rhyme with one another. I think that's a little bit too English sounding. It sounds to me too much like Pope. We also have heroic verse, which is no rhyme, but still iambic pentameter, like Emily Wilson's new translation does that. Then we have something like what I've kind of tried to do, and what Richmond Lattimore tried to do. Peter Green, the great classicist, described Richmond Lattimore's translation as a loose, quasi-hexametrical structure. In other words, you kind of give it a lilt and a flow and, I think, a dactylic gallop, but you don't fix it in a particular meter, because I think dactylic hexameter is weirdly more free and more variable than any English meter that we really recognize. So I'll just read to you my translations one more time so you can get the feeling for that. Rage, goddess, sing me the fury of Peleus' son Achilles. And there's another translation problem. I've translated Manus 2 different ways in one line there, rage and fury. Sometimes I think you have to do that to get the full spectrum of one Greek word across, or one original word into 2 different words. And I think repetition is one way to do that, but it comes with its own perils and challenges. Rage, goddess, sing me the fury of Peleus' son Achilles, death-dealing, laying uncountable wounds on the Greeks, hurling so many strong warriors' souls down to Hades, heroes turned into carrion feasts for the dogs and the flocks of birds. Zeus had his plan carried out to the full. So hopefully you get a sense of that drumbeat there behind the Iliad, which does come up in the Greek, and it's not the same meter exactly, but it does have that kind of lilting line. Now, here's what I did to try and get that lilt across in the Odyssey, with its much more kind of rambling and wandering feeling. Tell me, muse, about a man of many ways and wanderings, after he sacked the citadel of Troy, the many towns he saw, and how he came to know the minds of all the many men that lived there, how his heart was wounded many a time at sea, straining to gain his life back and bring his comrades home. I love these poems so much, and I'm really excited to get back into them with you guys. I think there is just a lot to say. If you want to follow along, I always recommend the Fagles translations, the Robert Fagles translations, and you can read one book at a time. The books are relatively short. If this is your first time with Homer, take your time, work into them, read them aloud, do all the stuff that you do when you're getting to know a new book. But I think that this will be really, really fun, and I'm looking forward to starting with you next week at the very, very beginning of the story. We're going to talk about the judgment of Paris and the outbreak of the Trojan War, and we will take it from there. But first, let's do a mailbag question. So since we're now moving out of the realm of politics, I'm going to take a more buzzy, newsy mailbag question. These questions come to me through Substack. Please do subscribe for my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And you can DM me there or respond to the emails that you'll get from me and ask me questions. Here's one from subscriber Blaine. He says, why is the Western ruling class rejecting reason? Over and over again, I am reminded of unexamined biases that propel them: white guilt, ecological guilt, that humans are a plague on the earth, that we ought to rule the stupid commoners, managerial state mindset, and so on and so forth. But I would like your take on what is really at root here. So basically he's saying, how come everybody seems to be going so crazy? And how come especially there are these reigning ideologies like DEI or like woke politics that seem to be expressly anti-reason? And I'm not saying this as a pejorative exactly, as so much as a description. We've had actual infographics from like the Smithsonian that say, well, white logic is racist, and what's bad about whiteness is its fixation on logical structure, which of course is itself an incredibly racist thing to say, since every human being is capable of using reason. That's part of our human inheritance. But there's this idea out there that reason itself is the bad guy, or it stands in the way of true justice. And there's a million examples of this you could cite. I always come back to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying people are more worried about whether I'm factually correct than whether I'm morally right. And that's a classic example of something we're all tempted to think sometimes. It's not like Republicans don't do this too. Of course, you think, well, I would let reality get in the way of a good theory, right? And so there is something kind of perennial about this. But I have a hot take in response to Blaine's question about why people are suddenly just spiraling out of their facts and logic kind of stance. And that is, I'm not really sure that the reigning class was ever all that committed to reason as a principle in itself. I think that for a while in Western history, reason and logic were useful calling cards for people to claim power and authority. And this starts really with the collapse of monarchic authority. In the West, we have a period of turmoil and revolution shortly after the Protestant Reformation and the printing press and all that, where people start to say, do you know what? I actually don't think God said that this inbred schmuck, is supposed to be able to tell me what to do. And there are good and bad versions of this, and you can get down on the French Revolution and up on the American Revolution, and you can have all sorts of minute discussions. But basically, that was an idea whose time had come. It was a fiction that made a certain degree, that represented certain truths, like the need for order, like the need for an order embodied in an autocratic leader in certain times and places, but which was not, in fact, the absolute divine will for all time and eternity, for people to be ruled by kings. So you then had the overthrow of this idea that there was somebody who was divinely vested with authority. And instead, the argument went, reason was divinely invested with authority. And now I think this is true. I think that reason is one of our connections, our ways of connecting to the divine, because truth is God's and reason is the human way in time of making our way to truth. And so this is part of our nature as being in the image of God, as having a connection to the divine, of an ability to connect with God's truth and all of that. And so I think that this development, which you might think of as a kind of Enlightenment era development, was a good move toward the truth, right? Away from the idea of the divine right of kings, toward the idea of reason. But nothing that people do in politics is ever really disinterested. Academia, truth, the search for reality, all of that is always going to be, at best, a handmaiden to power politics. And power politics is only ever interested in the truth as a means to an end, which is why, if you're like me and you want the truth and you want to live a life of the mind and you want to seek what is true, good, and beautiful, you have to keep yourself at one arm's length away from politics. Not because there aren't good political causes, but because politics per se, in itself, tends toward the acquisition of power. It's in some sense the art of the acquisition and wielding of power. It's not that that's inherently dirty, it's just that that is not the same thing as wanting truth. Some truths are inconvenient, some truths stand in the way of doing things well, some truths have to be modified and disregarded at times or emphasized at other times in order to keep things ticking along in some sort of orderly way. And so I think that in the wake of the Enlightenment, it became very persuasive and powerful if you could claim that reason was on your side, because people had this new respect for reason as our route into the divine. When if it wasn't going to be the Catholic Church, if it wasn't going to be the kings, it was going to be individual human reason. And this is why all these different forms of credentialism, of rubber stamping, of authority came to be associated with things like the science or with the data or with rhetoric and argumentation. And it's not like this was the only time in history this has ever happened. Athens is another good example. Similarly, a time when power was vested in the people and reason started to become sort of the claim that you could make to having a right to lead or rule or whatever. There's a difference between that state of affairs in which leaders have to make rational arguments in order to rule, and the Platonic ideal state of affairs in which leaders actually love reason and the truth for its own sake. And I just don't think we live in that world or have ever lived in that world. And I suspect that now, under digital conditions, as the postmodernist era starts to kind of crumble, we're losing that facade where leaders thought they had to make a rational argument in order to rule. And you've got people who are actually interested in wielding power in different ways, through deception and through miscommunication and misdirection, and ultimately through false narratives. And I don't think that the people who are currently in charge are any more or less interested in reason for its own sake than the people who used to be in charge. It's just that everybody who seizes power and aims for power is ultimately interested in power. And reason, for a while, the incentives of reason and of rational thought were nicely aligned with the incentives of those who wielded power. Now, part of our problem, part of our crisis is that those incentives are starting to diverge. And those of us that are alarmed by this state of affairs are having to think of ways to re-incentivize morality, reason, and truth as things that the people get to demand of their leaders. And the only way I think that we can plausibly and feasibly do this is by utterly rejecting our current ruling class and delivering to them a crushing blow in the next election. And so that's where you do hope for political success. If you've ever encountered Lord Acton, who was one of the great sort of theorists of ordered liberty, he has this wonderful quote that the friends of liberty are always in the minority, and they always have to be making common cause with other factions who want other things for other reasons. And I think the friends of liberty have sort of lost their old coalition and are having to build a new one with the people that want economic revival in America, with the people that want closed borders and security. And that coalition is coming into shape, and I think it's a good one, and I think we're going to have to move forward with it confidently and vigorously. But I think the reason that you're seeing people abandoning quote-unquote facts and logic is because those people, the people who are just interested in power, were never really all that interested in reason for its own sake to begin with. I know that's a bit bleak, but also I think there's strength in realism, and that's the truth, really, that I believe about politics and its relationship to rationality. But we, on this podcast, love the truth for its own sake, or at least we always try to. And I'm grateful to you for coming with me on that journey. As always, I want to tell you about one little other thing in the I Maked This segment that you might enjoy that I have written. And this time it's a response to the utterly ludicrous, speaking of irrational elites, the utterly ludicrous Rachel Maddow suggestion that J.D. Vance only likes Lord of the Rings and names things after Tolkien properties because he is some sort of crypto-fascist. And J.D. Vance's company is called Narya, which is one of the 3 rings of the Elven Kings. And in the Washington Examiner, I wrote a little fun takedown of why this is an absurd thing and why Narya is actually a pretty good name for Vance's company that can maybe help us gain a little insight into what he wants to do and what he's up to politically. So that's in the I Maked This section. I also have one other announcement, which I will make again and in other contexts, but I've been getting some questions about it, so I just wanted to say we have had a slight delay in the production of my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which I'm still extremely excited for you guys to get your hands on. If you've already pre-ordered it, don't worry, you will get it. It's just coming out slightly later on October 1st. So after the summer is over, go drink your White Claws, have your summer, and then come back and we will talk about how new science is illuminating ancient truths about God. Really stoked. I'm sending off the last proofs to the printer very, very shortly. Just wanted to let you know that it's going to be coming a little bit later than we had previously anticipated. You may have gotten some emails about that. Don't worry, your pre-order still stands. If you haven't pre-ordered already, please do. That link is also in the description. Thanks again for listening. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.